Good afternoon, welcome. My name is Patricia Baquedano Lopez. I'm chair of the Center for Latino Policy Research, and I will just say a few words, and Gabino Redondo will then introduce our speaker today. We are very, very happy to co-sponsor this event, and we're very happy to have you here today, looking very forward to an important work, to hear about important work, to dialogue about important work, and we are just honored at the amazing scholar and the presence que es Ana Celia Zentella.
Thank you, Professor Baquedano Lopez. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Professor Ana Celia Zentella. These talks are always in part a personal affair, so before giving you a long list of Professor Centella's illustrious work, I want to give you a brief account on how her work has influenced my scholarship. So one of the first books I read in graduate school was Growing Up Bilingual, and I think many of us also have read that book. And during this time, there was a group of graduate students at the School of Education who were discussing how to better understand code switching and the phenomena of mixing languages in the Chicano communities. So to me, Spanish, English, Spanglish, code switching was not just something you read about in graduate school, but a matter of real life, of everyday life. It was a testament to the creativity and the vitality of a people who found themselves between multiple worlds. So reading about the various languages and ways of speaking of El Bloque in her book gave me hope to this line of questioning. And this topic was important to look at, and that it can be done in a rigorous and ethnographic perspective. So yet the rigorous study of language does not preclude the important political work of bringing to light the challenges of that Latinas and Latinos confront in the face of racist language and educational policy. This commitment to what Professora Zentella has called anthropolitical linguistics has served as a model in my academic career and that of many of my peers. When a group sat down earlier this year to discuss which professors to bring on campus, one of the first names we had that came out of our lips was Ana Celia Zentella. So Ana Celia Zentella is a professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC San Diego. She is a central figure in the study of U.S. Latino varieties of Spanish and English, Spanglish, and language socialization of Latino families. She has been a persistent and respected critic of linguistic profiling facilitated by English-only laws and anti-bilingual education legislation. Her book, Growing Up Bilingual, Puerto Rican Children in New York, won the book prize of the British Association of Applied Linguistics and the book award of the Association of Latina and Latino Anthropologists of the American Anthropology Association. She has edited Building on Strength, Language and Literacy in the Latino Families and Communities, and her most recent edited volume, Multilingual San Diego, Portraits of Language Loss and Revitalization, came out a few weeks ago. And proceeds of this book also go to the scholarships in ethnic studies at UC San Diego, and we have some handouts there about the book. So today, Professora Zentella will be speaking about her most recent work on the remapping of language, identity, and the border by Transfronterizo students who live in Tijuana and study in San Diego. So please help me in welcoming Professora Ana Celia Zentella.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Patricia Baquedano Lopez and her wonderful group of students. I envy her this wonderful collection of students who are interested in issues of language and social justice. And they are very lucky to have her also, as they recognize. I was glad to spend yesterday with them. The work that I'm talking about today is the first part of a two-part study. This is really work done with college students, and it was supported by UC Nexus in collaboration with COLEF, el Colegio de la Frontera in Tijuana. You know that the Tijuana-San Diego border is probably the largest of all of the cities along the 2,000-mile border. There are 2 million people on either side at least, and it's projected that something like maybe 40,000 students travel between Tijuana and San Diego and move between worlds that are often stereotyped as contrasting along the lines of, you know, beautiful, clean, and very expensive city versus the kind of shanty town that a lot of the students actually, some of the students do live in. I'm interested in the reproduction of linguistic and educational inequality, and ask with this research if the linguistic abilities, practices, and attitudes of Transfronterizo students reinforce or challenge in the first place the classic notions of the ideal bilingual that were posited by Uriel Weinreich, who switches from one language to the other according to the appropriate changes in the speech situation, interlocutors, topic, etc., but not in unchanged speech situations, and clearly not within a single sentence. These students who have lived in 2 worlds, that is, they either live in Tijuana or in San Diego, or spent years going back and forth between both countries, are often touted as the future of the border by people like Venegas, Garcia, and Romo, who held a conference in which they talked about these students as the possibility for challenging the dominant negative narrative about language, culture, identity, and academic failure that exists about Mexicans on the border. In other words, these young bilinguals are looked to with great hope for the future. The checkpoint, of course, has made it more difficult for students to go back and forth. Sometimes it can take between 30 minutes and 4 hours to travel the border. These students spent approximately some between 2 and 17 years traveling back and forth across the border to study. There are 39 students in total, mainly almost equally divided between males and females, and we spoke to all of these students for approximately 2 to 3 hours. This is the MySpace webpage of one of the young women that we spoke to, and we didn't see this until after we finished our project, but she actually has a picture of the Límite. This is the same stone marker that is in all the towns. If you go to Nuevo Laredo and Juárez, the same marker is there. And on her MySpace, it says, el letrerito que veo todos los días, solo una línea que divide vidas. And in fact, I had asked the students in our group, how powerful in your mind is the border, and asked them to choose from among 4 lines of intensity. And the first female, D, says, it's just so powerful. I mean, I crossed that border, and that was the line that divided my life. This is not the young woman whose MySpace page has that. Maybe that was the line that divided being somebody or not. So this notion of the border and the opportunities that it represents as defining these young people is one of the attitudes. But on the other hand, you have number 7, who did not pick D, but who said, para mí es la A, porque es permeable en mi caso, pero te apuesto para el que se murió hace rato cruzando la frontera va a ser esta. And then she points to D. So there's an awareness among these students of the crisis on the border, of not only the real price paid by people with their lives, but also the differences in terms of the role of language on the border and the ways in which it constructs critical aspects of their lives. Now, cross-treaty reminds us that language and communication are critical aspects of the production of a wide variety of identities expressed at many levels of social organization. And Bourdieu reminds us of the illusion of linguistic communism, the notion that language, the appropriate language, the language with capital, is in everybody's grasp, and that it's your fault if you don't get to speak the way that opens up the border, the opportunities for you. And Urcioli's work is also important as a background to me. I don't know how it became E instead of C, pero it's because she reminds us that race has been remapped from biology onto language in very important ways. In other words, both the notions of race and language have these hierarchical components. There are superior and inferior varieties of races and of languages. And there's this notion of the importance of keeping strict divisions between races and languages, because crossing or mixing is polluting, so boundaries must be enforced. The big difference between the model of race and language is that biology cannot be changed, but your language can and should be. And so what happens in today's, in the era in which people are talking about the Latinization of the United States and how salsa outsells ketchup and how more guacamole is sold during football Sunday than anything else, the fact of the matter is that what has happened is that although it's no longer cool to make comments about people's race, it is very cool to talk about baseball players' English or to criticize the accented Spanish, and that comedians do this all the time, and it is acceptable to talk about people's language in ways that is a cover for racial coding. The students on the border have been subjected not only to the California-wide movements against immigrants and the criminalization of people without documents, but in particular the fact that they go to school in San Diego, often without having an official family residence in San Diego, but living with other family members there, has caused articles like this to appear that make them the subject of parent association meetings on the U.S. border, trying to root out who in the schools should not be allowed to study there because they don't have legal residency there. All of these students, by the way, can go back and forth because they are U.S. citizens. They were born in the United States, but many of them live in Tijuana because it's cheaper to live in Tijuana, or they have family with, or they live with a family in San Diego. Spanish has a very important role in the identity of these transfronterizos. I call them transfronterizos as opposed to fronterizos because fronterizos have links directly to only one side of the border, or more links to one than the other. These students really spend a great deal of time on both sides of the border, often traveling in one day, but certainly in 1 week from one country to the other. And Spanish has a very important role there. I'm going to read the Spanish, and the English is there for those who don't understand Spanish. Eran de descendencia mexicana, pero ya muy aculturados. Definitivamente sí, puro inglés, o sea, ni sus nombres los querían decir bien en español. They are immediately use Spanish as a way of identifying themselves against Mexican Americans who, like them, are U.S. citizens, but who don't have that control of Spanish that these kids have. And o sea is written as one word because it has become a phenomenon that I will talk about a little later. And talking again about these Mexicans from the U.S. Side of the border, el español lo hablan como tipo inglés, pero tienen el nopal en la cara. Those of you who know the Caribbean will know that this is the equivalent to tener la mancha de plátano. When they're pushed about whether or not these kids that they go to school with are Mexican or not, straight out Mexican, no. I would say Mexican American. It varies so much if they don't know the language. I don't think they can claim themselves as Mexican. And then this longer piece points out how and why people sometimes try to say they don't speak Spanish. La imagen que tenemos los mexicanos no es muy bueno, que digamos, así como que te asocian con puras delincuencias. Y a veces es difícil demostrar que tú no eres uno de esos mexicanos. Por eso mucha gente prefiere ser así como, ay, yo no hablo español, para que digan, ah, ese es uno de los otros mexicanos, de los mexicanos que es más americano que mexicano, pues. No es de esos mexicanos cholos y de ese tipo de mexicanos, okay? I've underlined ser así como because if you know Anglo-Californian middle-class speech, this is a be like. This is their like, and I will talk about likes. English for this group has enormous symbolic and cultural capital and is linked to legality, to respect, to occasions of envy, and is a mark of intelligence. When asked about whether or not you could cross the frontera, depending only on your English, one of them said, I did it once because I forgot my mica. What did you do? I said US citizen, but just once. How good does your English have to be? Just good enough. I mean, just don't trip. Don't sound like Jess. US citizen. Is your English enough, or do you have to look a certain way? Well, if you look like very, very Mexican, like if you have like a sombrero or something, I mean, they're not going to believe you with a virgen tatuaje. This is why we're linguists. We love people to speak for us. They're much better than we can ever be. And one of them points out that after 9/11, this all became much tougher. Honestly, right now, I think the only way you can get across the border with no ID is if you are the stereotype of a white kid. In other words, language is no longer good enough. It used to get you before, but not anymore. These are the scenes that they see and that continue to reinforce this notion of if they can go back and forth between the borders, they have access to capital. And they know that speaking English in Tijuana is sometimes envied and sometimes criticized. So that A says, en México, si hablas inglés, te dicen como que, ay, another como que, another like, ay, tú, ¿qué te crees? Qué ridículo, o qué estirado, qué creído. Entonces, pues, no lo haces. Another one says that about the people who speak English in Tijuana, están presumiendo que vienen de este lado, que según ellos que están en un lugar económico mejor que los de México, simplemente por el hecho que están en Estados Unidos, y todo eso lo ejemplifican al hablar en inglés. On the other hand, these young people have also had occasion to be envied by people who don't speak English, and they know that that can also, people want to speak English in Tijuana for the capital that it represents. But when they come to study, for example, at a university like UCSD, they hit for the first time other people who are not Mexicans. Right now I'm studying a high school on the border where most of the students have never had a close friendship with an American, a white American student, an Anglo-American student. So when the ones who come to UCSD have a very rude awakening, for example, when they meet roommates like this one did. They have this bad image, like when, well, she was my roommate, and she's like, I was talking to my friend about my grandpa because he was white like skin with blue eyes, and she was like, oh, was he Mexican? And I'm like, yeah, he was like Mexican from like central Mexico. She's like, oh, I never knew that Mexicans could be white, could have white skin. I'm like, what? She's like, yeah, aren't Mexicans like brown, short, and like bald, and like tattooed? And I'm like, no. I mean, that was only in like one movie. What are you talking about? She's like, I thought you guys were all like that. And I'm like, no, my mom is like super white. She has like almost green eyes. What the hell are you talking about? She's like, I thought all Mexicans are like that, brown and like brown hair, bald and old and bald and short. And I'm like, what the heck? No. And it's because of that, because like if you see the movies, like I don't know movies about cholos and they're all Mexicans and they're all like, yeah, vato. And people think we're like that, like all of us, and it's not true. So they're like the bad stereotype of the Mexicans. These experiences reinforce their attempt to use Spanish and a very fluent bilingualism to disassociate themselves from the stereotype that their learning people have of Mexicans, even in Southern California. The famous sign that is part of in the surrounding area in Southern California also means that linguistically they define Spanglish as the language of pochos who speak mocho, okay? Pocho being the term for US-born and or raised Mexican Americans, and mocho meaning sliced or cut off the way that they speak when they mix both languages. And they maintain Weinreichian notions, some of them, of this kind of bilingual who is two monolinguals stuck at the neck. In other words, el ser bilingüe es que sabes los dos idiomas bien, es tener cultura. These very rigid notions of language separatism and linked to high culture. And that the majority, la mayoría de mexicanos que yo conozco, o sea, lo criticamos mucho, talking about Spanglish, se nos hace algo ridículo, ¿no? Arruinas los dos idiomas. The notion that Spanglish is ruining both languages and that the people who speak Spanglish are pochos. Los pochos se juntaban con algún mexicano y así, pero casi eran la mayoría puros mochos. Hablaban Spanglish a todo poder. Talking about the students at the high school. Pocho for me means doesn't know English and doesn't know Spanish. Again, this definition of Mexican Americans as alinguals or semilinguals, doesn't know both languages and doesn't know both of the cultures, kind of like a state of limbo, is lost. He identifies himself as one thing or another, but really he's nowhere really. He's in a state of limbo. He can't speak to you about either American or Mexican history and culture. They also see themselves as harder working than both the Mexicans who stay in Tijuana and don't cross to study, and the Mexican Americans, because they have to wake up earlier, because they have to deal with two languages and two cultures, and they try to say that they don't really see themselves as special, but they do. No especiales así de superiores, pero de cierta forma así como macheteadores, pues. Así como pues le chingamos más. No es así de que, ay, me levanto a la hora que se me dé la gana. O sea, si entro a las 10 a la escuela, me levanto a las 9. O sea, yo si entraba a las 7 me tenía que levantar a las 4. O sea, era cosa así de que era más chinga, pues, así como, o sea, tuve que aprender otro idioma. Okay? This view of Spanglish as a product of the border viewed negatively from the center is challenged by some, because almost all of these transfronterizos have themselves been called pocho at some point, because they do speak a lot of English. They have been caught speaking English in Tijuana. They know less of the current Spanish terms than friends who have never left Tijuana. And yet others, like number 2, says, pochos are trying hard to speak in Spanish. They want to communicate, so they're making an effort to speak in Spanish, even they don't speak it well. Now, somebody else has a much more elaborate understanding of Spanglish, El Spanglish a mí no se me hace como una decadencia del español ni una vergüenza, no para nada. Es que es un contexto diferente. Si vives en frontera, no se puede evitar. Yo creo que tendrías que luchar mucho en contra de eso. Y al mismo tiempo estarías negando una dinámica que se da solo en frontera, que es hablar así y todo el mundo lo habla y se te sale. So the natural result of languages and cultures in contact is viewed by this student as not negatively, and another student goes on to in fact challenge the notion of people from central Mexico in particular, that this is a contamination and that it's part of what norteños in Mexico are accused of doing anyway. Un amigo que creció y todo en el DF decía que el español se estaba contaminando, así bien extremista, pero pues todo eso tiene que ver con la visión del centro de la periferia, todo lo que es frontera y la falta de integración a la identidad nacional. And I think that this student really hits the nail on the head. They understand that people in the north of Mexico anyway are criticized by central Mexico as being too much under the influence of the United States and being too agringado. There's too much English there. There's a very interesting comment that I heard from somebody I met on a plane who says, about Monterrey being the kind of cutoff point, donde empieza la carne, termina la cultura. And this notion of that's una zona ganadera, so there's a lot of meat there, but it's also this connection to the U.S. and to the end of Mexican culture being linked to. So the people in the northern part of Mexico who have never been to the United States are criticized by the center. And then those kids on the northern border distinguish themselves from the people who are in the United States by using the same stereotypes and linguistic model. So then the question is, in fact, will these transfronterizos challenge or reproduce linguistic and educational inequality? Do they have this transfronterizo cultural capital that is going to make all of the difference that Venegas Garcia and Romo believe? Those who are multilingual, have strong identities, and are well educated, have expanded employment possibilities, consumer choices, and more flexibility in their lives. Those who do not are at a distinct disadvantage. So this elevation of transfronterizo capital is something that all of these young people have imbibed, although several of them are contesting it. Heller found in her study of the French-speaking communities on Ontario and Canada and high school students there, what she calls the commodification of bilingualism. And I also found that this was a prevalent motif in these college students' notions of themselves as bilinguals. What I call the view of two monolinguals joined at the tongue. And she goes on to say, because of the nature of the new economy, the ability to cross boundaries is important. What is valued is a multilingualism as a set of parallel monolingualisms. That's what I refer to as two monolinguals, kind of joined at the neck. Not a hybrid system. This new bilingual elite builds a position which marginalizes both those bilinguals whose linguistic resources do not conform to the new norms and those who are simply monolingual. So it positions them as superior to the Mexicans in Mexico who are monolinguals and to the Chicanos who are bilinguals but have a what they would call an inferior kind of bilingualism because they speak a lot of Spanish. There is also the idea, however, that by Achugar in a recent study, that now attitudes towards Spanish are changing in the United States, that there are linguistic and aspects of the linguistic and socio-political landscape that have changed and translated into different attitudes and a stronger linguistic marketplace for Spanish. So whereas in my work I still see a great deal of anti-Spanish Hispanophobia, and we see people fired for speaking Spanish on the job, even though they were hired for speaking Spanish. We see attempts to eliminate bilingual education programs in more and more states across the United States. We see Miss California being attacked because she spoke Spanish to people who were part of the in the entourage. And I don't know if you know about this incident that Miss California was told that she should not speak any Spanish to any of the workers in the area, and they told her that she was not eligible for the award because of her speaking Spanish to the people. This researcher feels that although the Hispanophobia that characterizes the U.S. is still felt, the expansion of domains of use of Spanish to the more valued public sphere is challenging the stigma attached to Spanish as a minority language. For middle-class professionals at the border, there are opportunities to use their bilingual talents and their knowledge of two cultures, as well as of two businesses and legal systems. This again is the commodification of their bilingualism and the notion that they need to have a very special kind of Spanish skills and English skills that will enable them to function in these two worlds as if they were multilingual. On the other hand, I want to really end by, so that we can talk more about this, with this example of a young man who is one of the few who in his interviews switches back and forth a lot. The other students actually do this, but they do alternate for interlocutors a la Weinreich, but they have pronounced attitudes for the most part against switching in the middle of a sentence. He not only switches in the middle of a sentence, but is also explaining why he does this and what he thinks it represents. And one of the reasons why I'm very glad to see that the people in this room are interested in language and context is that I'm doing an analysis of likes here, I'm doing an analysis of oseas, but you have to look at what people are saying when they're talking about these issues also, and not just count the likes and the oseas, because what they're telling you about their situation and about their attitudes is at least as powerful as the linguistic, the discourse markers that they use. So in this, I'm going to just read out the left-hand side. It goes on for a little while, and the English translations are on the right. And he starts by telling us, por ejemplo, si yo estoy hablando ahorita y te trato de decir algo en español, pero no me sale, I would have to say it in English, porque that way it will be easier, you know what I mean? Y a veces I tend to do that all the time. Por ejemplo, like I would talk Spanglish, I would speak Spanglish. So he brings up this term himself. And then says, le preguntamos, ¿y si lo haces? Yes, I would do that all the time with my friends. I would, sí lo hago. No siempre, pero la mayoría de las veces sí. It would be like this. Like I would say something in Spanish and then like, oh, you know, y empiezo a hablar español. Como que una frase completa en inglés y luego, pum, en español. Frijoles, o totalmente en español. Y pum, you know what I mean? Así. And I don't know if it's weird, but it's just the way. Yo pienso que es una dinámica ya de vivir aquí en la frontera, de que se te sale el inglés o se te sale el español. Para mí no es difícil. La verdad es que yo pienso que ya te aprendes. You get used to it. So it's like, I don't know, it's not even hard for me to, you know, like I'm talking to you in English, then in Spanish, boom, no sé. Y a veces cuando estoy en mi casa, mi hermana o mi hermano, they would hear my conversation. They're like, how can you do that? How can you talk in Spanish and change all of a sudden to English? Or me talking in English and then like, oh, sí, luego la otra vez este. There was this girl, you know, and I couldn't know how to talk to her like así, like we would do that, and she was like yo pienso que es como el siguiente paso, es como like, and this is, you heard it from me, the grammaticalization for the first time that I have captured of this combination. This has deep linguistic implications for whether or not this is changing at the grammatical level or just at the morphosyntactic level, etc. But here you have a como like together, where you end up with a metaphor for their for his own reality. Es como like, you know how I do that? Now es como like, and everybody laughs. It's something you don't even realize, like you talk in English and Spanglish, you know. Hay mucha gente piensa que es como una mutilación del lenguaje, pero para mí no es así. Para mí es como un tipo de metamorfosis que le pasa al lenguaje. Rompes ya la monotonía de que solamente el americano güero, blonde hair, blue eyes, only speaks English, or the Mexican dark skin, dark, only speaks Spanish, pero it's not like that. Por ejemplo, tienes the typical American, you know, who is also fluent in Spanish. Y tienes, por ejemplo, a la persona de México que he looks like native, he looks like como Benito Juárez. So there you have a like como, as opposed to the como like. He looks like como Benito Juárez, que él era moreno, chaparrito, like he would be fluent in English, you know? Like ya no hay, yo pienso que ya no hay división de razas. Yo pienso que quedan los estereotipos, pero yo pienso que la combinación de razas yo pienso que there's only going to be one race. So this young man's idealism about languages and cultures in contact, about the possibility for living within different identities, and avoiding the stereotypical blocks of Spanish for this group and English for that group. We have to wait to see what his working life will be like when he confronts the world of work, when he is actually living in, you know, raising children. And what's interesting is that he actually started to cross in high school and for high school and college. And he has been, for the most part, in public schools. The other students who began crossing very early on and went to private schools, especially Catholic academies on the US side, are children from the richer neighborhoods in Tijuana, and they're the ones with the most pronounced attitudes against Spanglish and against the US Mexicans, and who are trying to define themselves against that group. This young man was born and raised in Tijuana, and he chose A as the border image. In other words, for him, there's a very light line in that border. He can cross back and forth and doesn't see them as major differences. I have been calling for a while for an anthropolitical linguistic perspective as the basis for transformative pedagogy, and also as the basis for transforming the kind of sociolinguistics that I was trained in at the University of Pennsylvania, and also the kind of anthropology that I saw many community studies where there's very little information about the language practices of young people. This first work that I did is not ethnographic in great detail because we did not follow these students in their university settings or at home. I have now been conducting research on the San Isidro border in a high school, in a local high school where there are 2,400 students, and where I am looking at 5 major social networks: skaters, socials, punks, tectonics, I can tell you what these groups are later, and the kinds of language that they use in those different settings. And that gives you a much more, a deeper appreciation for not only the linguistic practices, but the socio-political context in which these practices emerge and which they reflect. And I think more and more, although that kind of work is very lengthy and involved, that following students in the different ambientes that they function in is very, very important. And I have less and less confidence in papers where all I see is a little bunch of quotes, you know, from people without the kinds of rich context about it. Now, I do think it's also possible to do some critical discourse analysis of these interviews and of the students when they're in interaction. And those of you who are in classrooms, I think it's very important to see which topics teachers bring up and follow through on, how turn-taking occurs, what are the pronouns used in these settings, because I think they can also provide another deep level. So I think there's room for a lot of different ways to focus in on this research, and we need a much richer methodology all the way around. I think the anthropolitical linguistic perspective helps you value non-standard dialects and code switching in contrast to elite definitions of bilingualism that some students have internalized, but which they really don't live by in day-to-day practice. And we know a lot about parents raising their children. You ask them, do you mix? They say no, and then you tape record them for a day and you see that they are in fact mixed. So it's important to be there with the tape recorder to capture real speech in real situations. We do this work because we're attempting to challenge, we're trying to get at the production of categories of social difference linked to language. That's what we're looking at, how language is used to reproduce inequality and maintain these rigid boundaries and categories of social difference. And we want to be able to challenge the symbolic domination of English and its naturalized connection with Anglo-Americans and the link between being Mexican and speaking pure Spanish. We're also hoping, like Cross-Pretty mentions, to reject ideologies, processes, and structural inequalities that produce rigid linguistic, cultural, and national boundaries, recognizing instead, as Cross-Pretty points out, that different types of identity are neither exclusive nor singular. I want to end by saying that I have found some interesting parallels between the Transfronterizo insistence on defining themselves against the monolinguals in their home country, especially in central Mexico, which they call real Mexico, kind of, you know, DF, etc., and also against the Mexican Americans that are their fellow students in the United States. This is very similar to what I see happening in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is attacked for being too Americanized by the rest of Latin America. It speaks too much English. I was just recently in Spain and someone told me, pero como en Puerto Rico lo que se habla es inglés, you know. People have this idea that it is not part of Latin America, it is too Anglified, too much under US control, and English is the representation of that. By the same token, the Puerto Ricans of the island try to defend themselves and define themselves against the New Yorkers or the Chicago Ricans or the Rochester Ricans, trying to use language as a way of saying that's them, that's not us. I see this as a hierarchy of language, a language pecking order in which the reaffirmation of very false boundaries about what Spanish is and what English is help to maintain national identities and imagined communities of speakers of a pure variety of the language. So I just want to thank the team that of students at UCSD and Guillermo Alonso Meneses, a faculty member at COLEF, who were part of the research team that worked with the transcriptions and the interviews. Bueno, Yeah, but we have time to.
So we do have time for questions. Just before that, I wanted to thank the groups that have sponsored this talk, of course, CLPR, and thank you to Patricia and Ruth and Blanca and everybody else that has helped. Also, the Laboratory for the Study of Interaction and Discourse and Education Research, the Graduate Minority Outreach, Recruitment and Retention Program, which has helped us to sponsor this event, and the Berkeley Review of Education, which is the journal of the School of Education. So we'll open this up for questions.
Yes, I'm very grateful for this opportunity because this has way too many pieces in it now, and each of them is like a separate paper, so you can help me focus in on this. Patricia.
Celia, realmente el trabajo es impresionante.
Sí.
Quería hacer una comparación bueno, un comentario sobre el estudiante que habla de Benito Juárez. And I think that that's like such the question of the imaginary, the work that the student is trying to invoke, the confluence of race and language, and an explanation of identity there, by invoking the prototype of the indigenous, right, with power, the only indigenous person with power in the history of like the political scene in post-revolution, right? And that is Benito Juárez, right? And you know the work that this student is doing, you refer to the invoking Benedict Anderson as to where does the student belong, how does he map race and ethnicity in the indigenous is really interesting, and I would like to know what he looks like, the student doing this,
yes.
you know, to invoke the one what I mean, the one Indian man who made it publicly after the colonial rule, right?
Yes. He is not one of the darker skinned students here, but I think you're quite right about this. And the high school students, I was just looking at my high school notes and thinking, well, this is, this is a very important thing, because one student says he speaks more Spanish than I do, and I'm much darker than he is. So they have very clear notions of the language-race connection. And in many other quotes that I left out here, there are mentions of the fact that Mexicans do this to other Mexicans, like at the border, the Mexican border people, etc., are constantly looking at people and trying to decide, how many questions do I ask him, and how deeply do I have to go into this, and people saying, and these students saying, pobrecito los pollitos, the pollos, the people who are trying to cross, they get caught because immediately they look like pollos, and they don't have the language to get over with. Yeah.
Gracias, Ana Celia. I'm very happy. It's very, very, very interesting, and it elicits me a lot of questions. But I wanted to, as a physician that is working and worry about the use of culture and the language in cultural competence that is mandated in the state of California for doctors practicing medicine with ethnic group like Spanish people. The doctor has to know the language, or at least to know some of the language to communicate with the Spanish. And for me, have been on a struggle because I am very critical of this. I'm very critical of the way that the message, the hegemony of medicine is going, public, and people begin to talk about race, because it's inferior, the genetic, the people are susceptible to some diseases more than others. But then you complicate my thoughts with your lecture, because you said the race have been remade or remapped from biology to language. And I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more, because I thought that was, you know, it's not one side to the other. For me, it was back and forth all the time. But you put me in a spot where I had to rethink.
No,
and
I think you're quite right. It's not a total remapping, but it happens. Bonnie is talking. This is Bonnie Urchiovi's work. Bonnie is talking really about the public references to race, and the fact that the owner of a baseball team was penalized. Don Imus lost his job on the radio. If you are caught on tape publicly making a racial comment, you are in danger of some penalty, because that is no longer politically correct. What remains okay, however, in public venues is the comment about the way people speak, and to make comments about their accent, to make jokes about their accent, whereas you can't joke about people's hair or, you know, facial features or color in public without risking a penalty. But certainly the underlying, you know, the strength of racial and racialization, and the strength of that model persists. So I'm glad that you know, are asking me to say, we're talking here about public pronouncements and the extent to which you can actually, you know, get away with the Golfers Association of America saying that you can't participate in a golf tournament in the United States unless you speak English. And then people landing on that because it's an economic problem, then, you know, that you would be eliminating the golfers from Korea and from many other countries. So it's that kind of issue that's really at stake. Yeah, Aaron wanted to tell me.
I want to ask, have you know anything about how bilinguals in this country and other countries speak in terms of, will they parallel what you described? I was thinking of, I don't recall, this is just anecdotal, that many people speaking in both, switching that way, for example, in other languages that the people I know here, right? And and I also remember I was giving lectures in Barcelona, and I was trying to think about how many times I would hear anyone speak Catalan versus Spanish, and spoke in that way. I've never heard that. And the same thing true with the Basque or Gallego in Galicia. And then I remember also that, they asked me, when I was in different groups, in one group they asked me to give a lecture in English. I gave it in English, and then I found that the students wanted to ask the questions they were supposed to ask in English. They had a difficult time doing that, okay? So some of them were very relieved when I switched to Spanish, for example. But I was curious about this in terms of other languages.
No, well, it's a very widespread phenomenon, Aaron. I mean, languages.
I don't see that many studies of it.
Oh yes. Yeah. Well, Kid is looking at Catalan, which is Catalan and Espanol, and
I've never seen her show me data where they switched this book.
Yeah, there is. She has an article on comedians and the use of these words that seem very similar in both languages.
No, that I understand, but I mean in everyday speech.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
This is where the sociopolitical, because it's also Quechuañol has been studied. So there are studies of Quechua Spanish mixing, and certainly it's very widespread. Wherever there are two languages and cultures in close contact, there is the possibility of this. there are very rigid standards against it, you know, militating against it, and that's what often leads people in educated circles to not do this in public, especially in a university setting. But when you follow those students home, they do much more of it. And certainly the Japanese are worried about Japlish, and the Chinese are worried about Chinglish, and the Greeks have a word, you know, and the Koreans have Konglish. So they're often talking about this same phenomena. The difference is where the language that you're talking about that is being mixed, as opposed to in Catalonia, where there is official support now for Catalan. You're talking about a subordinate language in the United States. And it's the subordinacy of Spanish that makes this seem like more of an affront. And that therefore is adopted by some people as part of a posture against this. I have to, at one point I will send you the website to a debate between me and Ricardo Otegui, who is my dear friend and colleague, about Spanglish and about the use of the term, the label Spanglish. We have no differences about the validity of this way of speaking, but we have enormous differences about the use of the term. He is very convinced, and he's written a 27-page article in Spanish in La Enciclopedia de El Español de los Estados Unidos, which doesn't have me in it or a whole bunch of other people who would argue with the positions of the Real Academia. But his notion is that we're doing a great injustice to these very students that we want to help by using the term Spanglish, because it communicates a gibberish and a malformed third way of speaking, etc. And my position is the position, again, of a linguistic anthropologist and anthropolitical linguist as opposed to a lateral linguist. He is trying to say this is Spanish in the US, just like there's Spanish in Mexico, just there's Spanish in Argentina, and I say, sorry, it's not just the same way. Talking about a subordinated language, you're talking about a language that has suffered direct threats, you know, at it, and you're talking about using a label that communicates the political nature of this and the subordinated nature of the people who are accused of speaking in this. And it calls us all to challenge those notions and to you know, bring back to the fore. If you're calling it the Spanish of the United States as if it was just like the Spanish of you know, Paraguay, you're eliding that whole history of oppression. Yeah, Carlos. Oh, espérate, esta joven quería preguntar.
It's related to that conceptually, though, in the sense that it really, you're talking about a continual evolution of a strategy of racial exclusion, right, via the language and reflective of the same. So now when you think about this point about, like, who is this person that's talking about things of Juarez in terms of bodies, some of those racialized, you know, ideas and, you know, subordinate language reflects that kind of history. And then I was just curious, you know, one of the things that I'm concerned about that I see continuously happening too is the children of recent immigrants, where the mother does not speak English, maybe the father, because he's employed, has that capacity, and then the children at 4 years old negate that language. I don't know if that's something you can comment.
Well, I have a whole book on that with the Building on Strength, trying to look not on that you know, that, but yes, this latest book, which is about language socialization in Latino families, but it doesn't, you know, address very directly. I mean, one of the things that we see happening is that the symbolic violence of English, this is not a theoretical issue. This is vivido en carne y hueso. You know, this is what people see when they see that they're turned away from jobs or they're turned away from apartments. You know, they understand that their children need to learn English, and so even though not too many of them are like some people I've met in New York, where they say, "Mi hijo el americanito solo habla inglés," you know, with a lot of pride in that loss. Here, there's a sense that it's so important, and everybody is telling you that to be a good mother means to teach them English and to help them, you know, develop their English.
Yeah, because it goes back to that same form of economic domination, right? Which is to retain the same issue ultimately, which is that these children, not that they're not valuing English, but that it's having the polar opposite effect of not valuing speaking Spanish and or understanding speaking language. I see other American children that are sent to Spanish school, and the kids that are growing within the family that have the Spanish not preserving that as a value, which will replicate the.
Well, look, I taught a course in Spanish at UCSD, El Español en los Estados Unidos, specifically announcing that it was going to be taught in Spanish, thinking that this was going to attract all the Mexicanos of the UCSD campus, and more than half the class was Anglos, who spoke all the time in their imperfect Spanish, and the Mexicanitos were like hiding under the, until we brought this out, hit it on, spoke to the issues of what symbolic violence is and how you end up feeling this way. But you have to remember that children are not immune from the fact, in Building on Strength, I point out that, for example, what is the cucuy in Mexican culture, which is a cuco for Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, the bogeyman, has become parents saying to their children, si no te portas bien, voy a llamar a la migra.
Yeah.
So it's not that the bogeyman is going to get you anymore, it's the migra is going to get you. Now, who is afraid of the migra? Spanish speakers, people who are not legal. In other words, it's the constant reaffirmation of Spanish linked to lower working class, to illegality, to criminalization by the outside authorities who can come and get you. And so we have a real bogeyman here that can separate you from your mother.
And I think pulling the context is so key, because it's in a context of a globalized market economy.
Yeah, that's why it's very hard. You say to people, that's the other problem, because then you say, okay, learn Spanish because it's going to get you a good job. Learn Spanish because you're going to be able to compete with all those Anglos who now speak Spanish better than you do. Learn Spanish, again, for these instrumental reasons. But it devalues, what the learn Spanish. So, I mean, one of the things that happens when you talk to Americans in the United States about the fact that they think Spanish is taking over English, and you point out to them the numbers of people who are losing Spanish and the extent to which the second generation no longer speaks it, never mind the third generation. And then you realize that you're feeding into this. You're telling them, don't worry, they're losing it, Because you can't make a strong argument for, having them keep it, because then they interpret that as you don't want them to learn English well.
Realmente me doy cuenta how much I miss having you as a colleague. One note quickly in biology, Bonnie is now 8 years out of date, because actually public analyses that make reference to biology and biological explanations of race are now back in vogue through the language of genetics. So there's a tremendous shift along those lines, where culture is not the only publicly legitimate discourse for talking about race. But I have a couple of questions. First of all, and you just used the term symbolic violence. I mean, I think that one could see a lot of symbolic violence in the sort of analysis here. And I wonder if you could relate this to looking at other forms of violence that's in the lives of some of these transfronterizos. First of all, the violence that is affected against them once they cross the border, and the class and gender-based violence that they may face on both sides of the border. So what, as well as now some of the forms of economic injustice that are being exacerbated, for example, by changes in the economic status of UC students vis-a-vis increases in tuition. So what about other forms of violence as they intersect with symbolic violence? The other was, it was a wonderful analysis of the border in terms of its representation. How do you imagine the border? But are there also other ways in which people imagine borders that aren't necessarily that one political linear border? How do people socially construct notions of border within your sample?
Yeah. I don't have the answer to that second question, except that as I look through the transcripts, I'll look more for that. We have either this sense that it's really just an impediment, you sometimes have to stay there for half an hour. If your family has a sentry pass, then you can get through more quickly. So some of them, like this young man, thinks, you know, that this is just a political quirk, you know, but that it's really not important. But others of them, I think, see it as a third zone. They call that area the third country, so that it's like, it's unique to itself. And when I talk to the high school students, it's very interesting. They're not interested in going to San Francisco or going anywhere else or anything. They want to stay there. And I think it's in part because the protection that that offers and the sense that this is a third, es otro país. So they don't have that sense of that order as being, I mean, their cousins are there and they're here and they go there and the other one is there. It's its own unit. That I have seen a lot, that reference. But I don't know if in terms of, you know, it's interesting that MySpace thing, I came up with that idea of the border visually for strength and power, just de mi cabeza. That was an imposed thing. But then here it is, that slab and that rock, which is at every single border place, which does mean to them, you know, and it's called la línea, you know, that's the way border is sent in Spanish. Es la línea, you're at la línea, you're not at la frontera. Yeah.
Muchísimas gracias.
Pero una pregunta, otras formas de violencia, I think that Charles was asking about. This is what these students are encountering once they leave that protected area. They are constantly in that zone. They don't feel that they encounter much of that. But when they leave that zone, they get a sense of more of that. And some of the, for example, the roommate who has these notions about what Mexicans are like. They also are suddenly confronted by people who have a real, when all of a sudden there's not this difference that they think of between themselves because they have papers and the people who don't have papers. All of a sudden they're all lumped in the same group with those folks, and they haven't been used to thinking of themselves in that way. And when people come to do roundups, sometimes they're included. One of our UCSD students was picked up at a bakery with all the other co-workers. He happened to have regularized his papers 2 years before, but he was caught up, guns drawn, you know, so there's real violence in that regard, and there's very little understanding of these differences. The other problem, of course, is what some of you know, of course, is all the mixed families where all the parents are illegal, but these kids have were born in the United States. So they're confronted with that kind of reality every single day, you know. But they really think that their two languages and their ability to keep them separate and their doing well in school and etc. is going to make the difference if they stay within that zone. Yeah.
Muchísimas gracias por su intervención. I have two questions. One comes out of an observation, because I'm Galician, so I speak actively Gallego and Spanish. And there is in the work that I've developed with Galician, speaking Castrapo, which is a mixture between Galician and Spanish, identifies you as a Galician speaker, as well as it does for many of these speakers, at least for many of these students you work with, that speaking Spanglish identifies you as a potential speaker of Spanish, or one that is trying at least to speak Spanish. So it is the same that happens there in Galicia. But then, without diminishing, because the discussion has been based very much into the anthropological and ethnographic and social linguistics, you were asking some comments and some feedback about the expression. And there is this, what I've been observing is this becoming of the light as a filler, as an authentic filler. But also they transfer it to the Spanish. So ser como becomes lexicalized.
Exactly.
And grammar, so that's
what I'm talking about, the grammaticalization of the ser como or como light. Of ser como, yes. I had a number of ser comos underlined there, what I'm more interested in is the fact that this light phenomenon, which has been studied to death, it's a quotative primarily, it introduces quoted speech, but it also functions it has about 7 or 8 other discourse functions, and has become a marker of basically Valley Girl stereotype speech, or also generally California middle class speech. And so the question is, where do these kids get this from if they are not in contact with these young people? And how does it become a marker? And whether or not it is in fact feminized and is more a marker of females than males. In this young man's, there are a lot of likes. It becomes part of what they're moving into. Now, what I want to see is if that is linked to o sea. O sea is a stereotype of the socials or of the wannabe, the fresas, and the group, this new word new word to me, mangueras, which is the wannabe, the narco wannabes. And this kind of speaking of o sea is very stereotyped. And it is, actually there are web pages I was going to play for you on where you can see an o sea speaking against the alternative. And I don't know why in this version I seem to have skipped a slide that's very important about the term naco, because to be a naco is very pejorative, and it's like to be lower working class, but the interesting connection there, to link it to what Patricia was pointing out before, is that it is actually from the word totonaco. And so it is to be indigenous, or to be like a, it's more than hillbilly, it's almost like the N-word. And there are all kinds of things of, avoid being a naco, don't have a bobbing head dog in the back of your car. Avoid being a naco, don't use t-shirts to, as upholstery for your car. All these ways of avoid being naco as a speaker. Don't say cornflake, don't say pexi, and all of these, pizza, etc. And it's a very clear demarcation of lower working class stereotypes of being out of the standard that's linked to being indigenous.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. And the question that I have is in terms of methods. And I also wanted to point out that it is important to have bilingual and bicultural interviewers in order to understand what's going on with this language, right? Because if someone says, for instance, me fui a mi chante a echarme un atole con chocolate, someone will say that's Spanish, but that's not really Spanish, right? It's Nahuatl, most of it.
It's been Spanishized and it's become part of Spanish.
Right. So first of all, what's the boundary between one language that says this is Spanish and this is not, and the other, in terms of methods, I'm thinking about your interviewers come from the United States. I'm assuming.
No, actually, they are Transfronterizo themselves, right, who have back and forth a lot.
And I guess my question is, what if would your data have changed, or the kids would have given you different answers if they knew that they were like, your interviewers were from la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México? And can you comment from
Well, this is why I talk about ethnography as being necessary for a fuller picture of these students. You have to see these students talking to their best friends. You have to see them talking to the Spanish professors. You have to see them talking when they go into a KFC to buy, you know, fried chicken. You need to see them in lots of different settings to see actually what identities they present, because they have multiple identities. And in the interview, you're probably going to get, you know, a very limited repertoire. Now, it's offset by the fact that I hired, for most part, people who are transfronterizos, and put them in those interview settings and situations so that they could speak about these differences, you know. So, for example, I didn't know this difference between plata and oro that exists, you know, for the people on the border. But plata is Mexican money, and oro is American dollars. So that again is another one of these, you know, if you hear it, you know, you're not catching what they're saying. So lessening the difference between the people who are your subjects and your researchers is very important, which is why we need more students from these communities who are kept out of the UC system in the UCs, so that they can get the training to do this kind of research. It's very, very important. The other question that you have about, Jonathan, whether or not, you know, this is not what, and there are very careful linguistic studies that look at the extent to which something is an adapted borrowing or a non-adapted borrowing. And, but again, you're right, one of the problems is trying to determine what belongs to what. At this point, you know, if I say, los teenagers están jangueando en el hall en vez de el grufo, you're telling me that that's English? No, no English monolingual will understand that. They'll get something, you know, if I say it really slow about teenagers and home. They might get that, but they have no idea what I'm saying. So those are English words that have already become Spanishized. And a lot of the lexicon of Nahuatl and a lot of the things that are part of what is called Pachuco talk have already become part of Spanish for a much wider group of speakers. And that's one of the things that we're looking at in terms of the extent to which these things are kind of coming together. So when I see a como like or a like como really blending together like this, it's very important that we point out. These are, you know, down the, in a few decades, people are going to be saying, oh, yeah, you know, Zentella was the first one to see this.
That's right. Again, this is a great talk. My question has more to do with the implications of your work for a sociolinguistic theory of style, because I think that's actually one word that we haven't used enough. But I think that really what you are talking about is what sociolinguistics has talked about in regards to style, in regards to when you change your speaking ways, in regards, you know, like, you know, in regards to who's there, like Alan Bell's work and so forth. So how do you see your work as making us rethink certain assumptions about style and what we should also take into account more of when talking about style?
One of the problems I have with the style itself is that, you know, again, there's this issue. I mean, there's style, there's register, there's, you know, and I don't see the clear boundaries, and then people talk about informal style, formal style. I think that it would be useful to, and what's interesting to me is the extent to which these, what I would call the informal code switch style, may be already gaining some foothold in more formal styles of speaking, and whether or not that's already happening for certain groups. It's certainly happening for the poets, who have no problem calling it poetry. And I have to tell you that the latest Pulitzer Prize was given to a Spanglish book. In case you have not read The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz, you really need to read this, because this is the Pulitzer. I don't know how those Gabachos understood that book. I don't know. First of all, not only is it full of Spanish, it's full of Dominican Spanish that you have to know. And then there's a whole third of it that I don't get because I'm not into science fiction, which is a whole other undercurrent of things. Now, he's got copious footnotes that are a riot and a mine of historical information in this novel. But how he won this, you know, this is Spanglish a todo dar in this novel. And it won the Pulitzer Prize. So, and In the Heights, if you haven't seen that, go to New York, it's worth the trip. To see Lin-Manuel Miranda's play In the Heights. So there it is on Broadway in Pulitzer novels. People are saying this is not just for the informal, you know, in-group style of speaking. But, so I don't know, tell me what you think it could be offering to this. No, because I'm interested in this.
I'm just curious because scholars have actually made comebacks in sociolinguistic work, and they've actually been and actually they've rethought what the Lebovgian definition of style is now. And so I'm actually curious as to see what you would add to that discussion.
And what is it that they're adding to Lebov's?
That inter-speaker switches are not enough anymore. That one also has to take into account Alan Bell's idea that, you know, the audience is also an important part of who allows the style switch to even occur. That it's not just I choose to switch. It's also that the interlocutors also play a role in that.
Oh.
And so you've got these other things happening too. Okay. So I'm actually curious as to see how the use of Hosea and Como like operate as a marker of, you know, of style in that sense, and what that can influence.
I think it's very important. One of the things that Bill's work was criticized for drastically, and by the way, it's not only Bill's work. I just entered into a research project with 3 professors from the Department of Linguistics at UCSD about border Spanish. And I have to tell you, they were amazed when I told them, you have to transcribe what the interviewer is saying also, not just the interviewee. And they said, really? Oh my God, that's a lot more work, you know? I said, you know, so that at that level, it's still not understood that what the person is saying is going to affect, you know, how they're being asked is going to affect what they're being, which is why I didn't put myself into these interviews as much, except to get a baseline, you know, with each kind of network and group, like for example in the high schools. I'm trying to work with people who will reduce the social distance between the people I'm interested in getting on tape, and so that that means gender distance, it means academic distance, it means class difference and regional origin, etc. To try and let that you know, come through. And then I have to look at how many likes my interviewers are producing en Oseas and whether or not that is triggering likes amongst them, amongst the people that they're talking with. But we don't have big like or Oseas interviewers.
Yeah, I just had a question about some of the recommendations you might make to policymakers, because in your work you kind of talk about this paradoxical dilemma of these Transfronterizo students. And so what do we do now? Because I'm going to go into education as a high school English teacher, so how do we address that problem, and is it top down, is it state, is it local, and, you know, how do we address those issues that are complicated?
Well, I believe very much in having students be ethnographers of their own communities and the way they speak. And so I think that, and of the values of those different ways of speaking. So that when you ask students to look and listen to the people that are around them in different settings, and to notice the way their parents change Spanish when they're talking to the priest as opposed to talking to their, you know, their best friend. That you help students understand the variability of language and the extent to which different ways of speaking are very powerful for different settings. I have talked to 5-year-olds about this, and they get it, because if you ask them, what do you wear to a big wedding, you know, they will tell you, you know, that they have very special shoes for that, or they have a special, it's the day they wear a dress if they're girls, etc., this and that. They know that there are appropriate ways of dressing. And if you say, and when you go to La Playa, you know, do you wear the same clothes? Oh no, you can't wear those shoes. You got to wear these chanclas, and you have to do this, and you have to do that. They understand that there are different ways, and that you have to be, you know, to be appropriate for those different settings. And then I ask them to think about the ways in which people speak in those different settings and what's appropriate in the different settings. And I think that's where you get the wealth of the community's ways of speaking available to them and understood by them. And then they can see, I mean, I was just in Germany talking to Turkish students, and people could not believe how I had 50 Turks, you know, listening to me and talking with me, because I was asking them, are you embarrassed by the way your parents speak German? You know, you can't ask them that directly. You say, what do you do if a friend of yours says they're embarrassed by the way their mother speaks German, you know? Because these issues of embarrassment, etc., bring up the notion of hierarchy of languages and what's more powerful and what you have to speak right, you know, and how other people can mess up your name in pronouncing it, but you have to get their name right, etc. So I think these are very powerful ways to bring up issues of power in the classroom, and to stress the validity of these different ways of speaking. Now, it's important. And they also will get the sense. I have to tell you that the bad part of this is that whenever I do this with students, sometimes they had no idea how devalued their community's ways of speaking were. And when that becomes obvious to them, then sometimes they go the other route, thinking, oh God, I got to drop that way of speaking altogether. I have to speak just English. And so then you have to do a lot of work around, you know, how that kicks in and why that kicks in. But Sami Alim has work on actually doing hip-hop ethnographies in classrooms with high school students. But I think it can be done at much younger grades with students looking at language and literacy practices in their homes and in communities.
And in terms of policy, I keep thinking of Zach Rubio, who was expelled from school when he spoke Spanish in the hallway. And so, how do we go about that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the extent to which and a local school and a district is helped to understand the ways in which people really become fluent. The question is, what are our objectives? I think we're about the same objectives, I always say to teachers and principals and superintendents. You want really fluent English speakers and writers. You want them to be able to write papers and to be able to express themselves very fluently. And I'm after the same goal, but we can go about it in very different ways. And I think there's enough work to show that your way of repressing the way they speak at home and other ways of speaking is going to be counterproductive. It may produce the one or two who are, you know, going to be, you know, the Brian Gumballs of tomorrow kind of thing, but in fact, what it's doing to them in their communities is going to be very damaging for them. And it's not necessary to do. And that's why I think work like, you know, I would bring out Junot Diaz's book in a minute and show people that this has been given the mantle of respectability. And who are you to say different?
We have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Thank you again for your talk. And I guess I'm interested in, so there's so many hybrid spaces for colonized people in particular. So it's language, if we talk about hip hop, there's culture. Right, and kind of how we use what we have in our midst to make new things, right? But I guess I'm interested in when people who are in the hybrid space enact sort of these policing of authenticity, sort of mechanisms of discipline. So whether it be language, you're not speaking the correct Spanish, or you're not, you know, doing something authentically like the way it should be. Like, how do we explain that process of we're in a hybrid space, but still we hold on to these sort of rigid disciplinary sort of functions, whether it be through gender, through culture, language. Like, how would you comment on that?
Well, being in a hybrid space does not give you powers of analysis and freedom from the oppression. It makes you understand, perhaps, the price that you're going to pay if you're going to take this on. And it's not only that you get taught this by Spanish teachers and by your well-meaning aunt who, you know, came to visit or whatever. You get this message everywhere, you know, that language is supposed to be pure. There are all kinds of people telling you, you know, what the difference between lay and lie is, and, you know, it is me and it is I, and all those structures. So you get a sense that language is one of the ways in which value is attributed to a person. Not only value, but citizenship and morality and, you know, worth. And so policing language becomes a way of your expressing that you are one of the people to be valued, not one to be mistaken for those others that everybody is labeling, you know, with this facile label of cholo. I think that being in the hybrid space doesn't, you know, I mean, Gloria Anzaldúa talks to us about, you know, the center of the borderlands, and the fact of the matter is that oppression oppresses, and you don't come out of it, you know, unscathed. There is a price to pay. And as Carlos said, it's not only a linguistic price, it's made, you know, more carne y hueso by all of the other structural inequalities that keep you from getting good medical care, that keep you from, you know, being able to live, and also that keep you circumscribed within a very particular, you know, political and social space.
It seems to me also that within your own framework of looking at language as a form of communication, as a tool, that in the politics, it would be that, you know, we have certain set of standards to function and things like that. It's one thing to embarrass somebody or tell them. So analytically, for intervention policymakers who are working with populations, say in the medical field or any kind of social service delivery provision that interacts with this public, it would be helpful for us, I think, if you're not already did this, probably you have, is to outline what some of the benefits within that context. What does it give us when we go into that role? Like, I often have some friends that I go into that code switch, like, I impress myself, I can go in Spanish, English without thinking about it, but I don't do that with everybody.
No, of course not.
Yeah. So that there's a contextual population, if you are trying to maintain that kind of harmony in the society and function in this kind of diversity, I'd say, to really pull together, you know, because I find that like maybe a lot of social interventions, they want to change the language rather than learn what's going on with the individual to try to meet the specific need.
Well, I think it offers you, working with language offers you an opportunity, especially in communities where there are many different groups. It gives you the opportunity to work with these other groups about Taglish, which is Tagalog English switching, about the switching in different communities, and certainly with African Americans. And it also helps to talk to you know, Anglos who think that there's nothing different about their English ever, you know, that they speak always the same way and in the same place, you know, always everywhere, it doesn't matter to whom they're speaking or whatever. And I point out that if that's true, they're very robot-like and they are not responding to the social situation setting. And so it's very unlikely that they're doing that. And when you tape record yourself over a number of different settings, you realize that that's not the case at all. You do change. And so just as people within one language change, these folks have two languages within which they can, you know, speak to various aspects of their identity. That makes it a universal phenomenon, not just something that Spanish speakers do.
You see it in the text.
Exactly. And that as a result of that connection to, you know, the power of language and its variability, we can speak to people amplifying their registers, their repertoires, you know, so they don't have just one pair of you know, one outfit to just go to school with, that they have another outfit, you know, that is for different settings and situations. So there's a linguistic repertoire, just there's a wardrobe for different settings. And it's valuable to expand that repertoire.
It's a beautiful analogy, the one that you use about the shoots.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, as I said, you can talk to little ones about this, and it comes out themselves. It comes out from them.
So, I want you to help me again thank Celia for her great and interesting talk. It was very enlightening. Also, we do have refreshments, and at 4 o'clock, the Linguistic Anthropology Working Group is hosting John Lucy, who will be speaking in 155 Barrows. Is that right? Okay, get it right.
Well, I'm happy to stay to talk with anybody who has other questions that they might have.
And we can do that over refreshments.
Yeah.